Welcome to TV spoilers. Young and the Restless revealed that Chelsea had always believed she'd learned how to survive among secrets and cold-blooded moves in the Newman universe. But some moments still had the power to drop her heart straight into her stomach months. That reminded her power wasn't just a polished game of contracts and quiet negotiations behind closed doors. Sometimes, power was a weapon capable of crushing a living, breathing person with nothing more than a calm sentence spoken in the right room. That day started like any other, ordinary enough that Chelsea never thought to be on guard. She moved through familiar corridors, heard the soft echo of footsteps on the floor, and felt the steady rhythm of a world that always ran like a machine. She assumed she was simply passing by another business conversation on of those exchanges she'd overheard 100 times before, but then she slowed, as if yanked back by a few words that landed in her ear like ice. Victor and Michael were there. Their voices weren't raised, not even close. And it was precisely that controlled tone that made Chelsea's spine go cold. There was no explosive fury, no uncontrolled ragingly and unsettling certainty, as if they were discussing removing an unnecessary piece from a chessboard. And then a name slipped out, dry and blunt: Matt Clark. It didn't sound like a person anymore. It sounded like a target, a problem, something scheduled to be dealt with. And the more Chelsea listened, the more she realized this wasn't an empty threat or exaggerated pressure. Victor spoke about eliminating Matt permanently with a terrifying calm, like a decision already stamped and finalized far beyond anything society could still call the law. Michael didn't object. Michael, the man everyone considered the legal safeguard, the one who was supposed to represent procedure and restraint, sat there and discussed it like an obedient cog in the machine. In that instant, Chelsea felt something inside her crack. Because if even Michael Simeone, who understood the law better than anyone, could slide over the line so easily, then that line wasn't real at all. It was just thin paint covering darker intentions underneath. Chelsea could feel the brutality of the plan, but not the loud brutality of street violence. This was the refined brutality of the powerful, the kind that didn't need to scream because it already knew it wouldn't be punished, as long as everything stayed clean enough, quiet enough, invisible enough. When Chelsea finally moved away from that spot, she didn't feel like she was walking anymore. She felt like she was drifting through thick fog. Everything around her was still the same Genoa city she knew: polite faces, practiced smiles, soft greetings, but inside her something had shifted permanently. The initial shock turned into nausea, not because she was weak, but because she understood she'd been dragged into a point of no return. Once you heard something like that, once you realized a human life could be arranged to disappear simply to tidy up the bigger picture, you lost the right to innocence. A brutal question rose in her mind. If today's victim was Matt Clark, a former enemy, a name most people wouldn't mourn, wow, could it be tomorrow? And if Chelsea stayed silent, what did that make her? A bystander? Or a passive accomplice who knew and still let it happen? In Chelsea's memory, Matt Clark wasn't a symbol of innocence. She knew his stains, his mistakes, the chaos he'd caused, the damage he'd done. Yet that was exactly what made the situation even more vicious. The plan depended on the fact that nobody would miss him. People would find it easy to believe he deserved whatever happened. They'd shut their eyes and move on if he vanished. And Chelsea knew Victor well didn't need the world to sympathize. He only needed the world to feel indifferent. Once indifference spread like smoke, any death could be buried as an accident. Any disappearance could be dismissed as rumor. Chelsea found herself forced into the most painful kind of moral reckoning. She wasn't choosing between good and evil in a clean, dramatic way. She was being cornered into choosing between right and safe. And choosing right meant crossing Victor Newman, meaning she'd be stepping into a danger zone. She wasn't sure she could survive without being destroyed. The hours that followed felt like living on a wire pulled tight. Every time her phone buzzed, she flinched. Every time Victor's name surfaced in conversation, she felt a needle prick the back of her neck. She tried to tell herself she'd misunderstood, that maybe permanent removal was only a figure of speech. But then she remembered Victor's eyes, his steady voice, the way he delivered the idea like a final, inevitable outcome. Chelsea had seen Victor dismantle people in business, had watched him ruin careers with a single move, had witnessed him erase reputations without breaking a sweat. But this wasn't about humiliation or bankruptcy. This was beyond the legal line. And that was what made it unbearable. The realization hit Chelsea hard. Victor wasn't just ruthless. He was untouchable, and he knew it. Chelsea thought of Connor, She thought of the world her son was growing up in, a world where adults could vanish because they became inconvenient to the most powerful man in town. She wondered what she was teaching Connor if she stayed silent. Because children don't need speeches about morality, they learn from the way adults live. If Connor ever found out his mother had been given the chance to stop something monstrous and chose to look away, what would he see when he looked at her? But then Chelsea hated herself for reaching for something noble. Because the truth was harsher. If she acted, Connor could lose his mother. If she provoked Victor, he could destroy her life overnight. He could strip away her stability, her work, her reputation, even her right to raise her child in peace. Chelsea had watched Victor do that to others. Now she had to admit she wasn't special. She could be next. Instinct pushed her toward Adam. Somewhere inside Chelsea, a thin strand of hope still existed, that a damp man who'd been thrown into the abyss by Victor. The man who knew what it felt like to be hunted would understand the fear twisting her stomach. She didn't go to Adam to accuse Victor. She went searching for an anchor, for an answer to the poison eating at her mind. Was she overreacting? Or had she just witnessed a line being crossed that no one could ever uncross, without becoming stained forever? Yet the moment she saw Adam's face, Chelsea felt another dread rise. Adam wasn't just someone Victor had hurt. Adam carried the Newman survival instinct in his bones, the instinct to stand near power when danger approached, the instinct to justify immoral choices as necessary, the instinct to call cruelty strategy. Adam had changed in some ways, but Chelsea knew there were parts of him that would never disappear. And the way Adam reacted made Chelsea's stomach drop. He didn't panic. He didn't look shaken. He didn't treat it like a nightmare. His expression held something worse: acceptance, almost resignation. Like a man who'd long ago stopped believing the world could be fair. Even without words, his attitude screamed, "That's Victor. That's how things work." That response hurt Chelsea more than Victor's ruthlessness ever could, because it proved how normal the unthinkable had become. She tried to reach for the human part of a damp part that once loved her. The part that tried to be a good father, but she saw only exhaustion and calculation. As if he was too tired to fight Victor anymore, as if he'd chosen survival over resistance. Chelsea left Adam feeling betrayed again, and this time the betrayal came from her own hope. With Adam no longer a refuge, Chelsea's mind turned to the names that still carried the meaning of conscience in Genoa City. Nick and Sharon. Nick had his limits, even when forced to compromise. Sharon, after everything she'd survived, still had the kind of heart that could recognize truth beyond politics and profit. Chelsea knew dragging them into this would be dangerous. But she also knew that standing alone would get her crushed. She needed witnesses, people who could confirm she wasn't imagining it. People who could help her build something stronger than fear. Yet when Chelsea tried to reach them, she immediately felt an invisible wall. Not because they didn't care, but because they were drowning in their own storms. Nick might have been too worn down after endless wars with Victor. He knew exactly what Victor was capable of. And sometimes people don't refuse to act because they don't believe they refuse. Because they believe too much, because they've seen how badly it ends. Sharon, carrying her own deep scars, could be living in permanent vigilance. But even vigilance has its limits when the enemy feels unbeatable. Chelsea could see their hesitation, and she couldn't blame them. But their hesitation terrified her anyway. Because it revealed the truth of Victor's real power. He didn't just win because he was strong. He won because he made everyone believe fighting him was useless. And when everyone believed that, Victor won before he even moved. Chelsea realized, with a bitter clarity, that if she wanted to stop the worst from happening, she would have to act on her own. She felt like she'd stepped onto a road with no map. She wasn't a cop. She wasn't a lawyer. She was a woman who'd spent years trying to rebuild herself, trying to raise her child, trying to earn a quiet life. But Genoa City didn't allow quiet for anyone who accidentally overheard the wrong secret. Chelsea was being forced to become someone she never wanted to be. A collector of truths in the shadows. Someone who had to play the powerful people's game just to protect a fragile line of morality. Her fear became specific, physical. She began thinking in terms of evidence. She needed proof, not just moral certainty, but something solid enough to make this real to others. But how did you gather proof against Victor Newman and Michael Baldwin? They weren't reckless amateurs. They wouldn't leave obvious trails. They wouldn't speak where easy recordings existed. Chelsea understood she was up against men who had spent their lives erasing footprints. That knowledge made her shake and rage at the same time. Because if the entire system was designed for the powerful to stay clean, while their victims stayed buried, what chance did someone like Chelsea truly have? Chelsea replayed every detail: where she stood, where they stood, how quiet their voices were, what words Victor chose, what Michael didn't say. She analyzed like a survivor trying to decode a predator's pattern. She wondered if anyone else had overheard, if a camera was nearby, if some accidental recording existed. She hated herself for thinking that way because it made her feel like she was stepping into the same filth she wanted to stop, but she knew she'd lose if she didn't. And in the middle of all that fear, Matt Clark began haunting her mind in a strange new way. Before, Matt had been a threat, a nuisance, an enemy. Now he became a symbol of a harder question: did a human being deserve to be handled like a disposable object because he'd done wrong? Chelsea didn't suddenly see Matt as a hero. She simply saw him as a life being weighed like merchandise. And she understood the most horrifying part of power: it didn't need justification, only an excuse people would accept. Matt had a past. Matt had caused trouble. Matt was disliked. That was enough. Enough for people to look away. Enough for Victor to operate without resistance. Chelsea felt trapped inside an ugly choice. Saving Matt meant defending a man most people wouldn't want to defend, and that could make Chelsea look foolish or even suspicious. But if she didn't try, she would hate herself. That was the kind of choice that offered no clean exit. Chelsea realized she was losing the simplicity of believing right and wrong were obvious. Genoa City forced people into gray zones where doing the right thing could get you destroyed. The tension wrapped around Chelsea thicker with every passing hour. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor's face, heard his voice. She didn't even need to remember the exact word. She's calmness was enough. She began doubting her surroundings. A strange phone call could mean she was being watched. A car parked too long outside could be a warning. A stranger's glance in a cafe could feel like surveillance. Chelsea knew she was sliding toward paranoia. But she also knew paranoia was sometimes the natural reaction when you stood in the shadow of someone who could make people disappear without consequences. Still, Chelsea forced herself not to collapse. Because she understood something painfully simple: if she fell apart, Victor's plan would become easier. And that determination hurt because Chelsea wasn't made of steel. She was a mother. A woman who had loved the wrong people, been broken, and still tried to rise. She wanted to worry about normal things, about Connor's life, about small daily problems. She wanted peace. But peace in Genoa City was something you were permitted to have and not something you were guaranteed. And that day, Chelsea realized her peace had been stolen with a single conversation she never meant to hear. As she weighed her next move, Chelsea understood she would have to be careful in ways she'd never been before. One mistake could reveal she'd overheard them. And if Victor knew, Chelsea couldn't even let herself imagine what might happen. Victor wouldn't need to strike directly. He could pull a thread and unravel her entire life: her work, her reputation, her rights, her stability, her future. Chelsea had seen it happen to others. Now she understood it could happen to her just as easily. That was why she knew she couldn't rush blindly. She began thinking about collecting proof in quiet increments, small pieces, careful steps, not reckless confrontations. She couldn't fight Victor head-on, so she needed to find the weakness inside his confidence. A man who had ruled too long often grew careless in places he believed nobody would dare touch. Chelsea clung to that thought like a lifeline. But her greatest battle wasn't Victor. It was herself. Part of her wanted to turn away, to convince herself Matt Clark deserved whatever was coming. To tell herself Victor was simply solving a problem, because if Chelsea believed that, she'd be freed from responsibility. But every time she tried, her own conscience fought back. It reminded her nobody had the right to decide life and death for convenience. It reminded her evil didn't begin with grand gestures, it began with small silences. And Chelsea's deepest fear was that she would become someone who stayed silent. Even if Nick and Sharon hesitated, Chelsea didn't abandon them. She didn't pressure them. She planted awareness, a seed of suspicion. Sometimes the only thing you could do was open someone else's eyes. If Nick and Sharon could see clearly, they might not act immediately. But they wouldn't blindly stand with Victor. And even that would be a step forward. Chelsea told herself this kind of war couldn't be won in one night. It required patience, precision, timing. But as Chelsea tried to be patient, another fear swelled: time was not on her side. If Victor was already discussing the plan, the countdown had begun. Chelsea didn't know when permanent would happen. Tomorrow? Next week? Tonight? That urgency turned Chelsea's thoughts into a storm. She felt like she was racing against an invisible darkness, forced to be fast but silent. She started seeing Genoa City with new eyes. This wasn't only a place of romantic betrayal and corporate revenge. It was a place where death could be arranged like paperwork. Chelsea couldn't believe she lived in such a world. And she couldn't believe she'd once thought she could escape it by simply being good. Eventually, Chelsea understood she couldn't just be right inside her own heart. She needed to turn that righteousness into action. But what action was possible when she had no real power? She felt trapped inside a sealed box where every wall was danger. If she went to the police without proof, she could destroy herself. If she waited too long collecting evidence, Matt could be eliminated before she reached him. If she confronted Victor, she could vanish before Matt ever did. Chelsea realized this was Victor's true strategy, forcing situations where no perfect choice existed, where every path carried a price, so that fear became the final decision maker. But Chelsea also knew this: if every choice cost something, she wanted to pay the price for the choice that would still let her look in the mirror without disgust. She wanted Connor to grow up believing his mother tried. She wanted to believe she wasn't a coward. And so Chelsea stepped deeper into the road she knew would change her life forever. That night, Chelsea sat alone under dim light, her face tight with strain. She stared at her phone, stared at her contacts, her fingers trembling. She knew that one call could flip everything. But she also knew that call could be the first step toward her own destruction. Chelsea felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, darkness below, her old life crumbling behind her. And just as she drew in a deep breath, ready to move, an unexpected message lit up her screen, on short line that froze her blood, because it proved her time was gone and Victor might have already started moving before she could do anything at all. Chelsea had never imagined there would come a day when she'd be forced to step back into the very darkness she'd spent years trying to escape. In Genoa City, people talk about power like it's an unwritten law, something that can bend every principle and turn the wrong into the ordinary with a single nod from the person standing at the top. But for Chelsea, Victor's power was never just boardrooms and signatures. Never only the ability to bankrupt someone or bury their reputation. Victor's power carried a colder scent than thought, a scent of silence purchased with money, of names erased from someone's life without explanation, of moral fractures sealed beneath a polished excuse that everything is for the greater good. Ever since Chelsea accidentally overheard Victor and Nick speaking about Matt Clark, she could no longer pretend she hadn't heard anything. Those words looped in her head, not like a simple threat, but like cold metal scraping bone, reminding her that something was moving forward in the dark, and if she stood still, she would become part of it, even if only as a quiet, passive piece. Chelsea had done plenty of wrong in her life. She'd made choices out of desperation, taken steps she wasn't proud of just to survive. But precisely because she'd lived through those shadows, she understood something many people refuse to face: evil rarely begins with blood or gunfire. It begins with indifference. And this time, she couldn't bear the thought of becoming indifferent again. At first, Chelsea tried to talk herself down. Maybe Victor had been exaggerating. Maybe Nick would be the last barrier, the final scrap of humanity capable of stopping his father from crossing the line. But the more Chelsea replayed the conversation, the more she understood what made it terrifying. Victor didn't need anyone's emotional approval. He only needed their exhaustion. Nick might hate it internally, might feel sick in silence. But if he was too drained from years of fighting the same battles, he could still choose to step aside and let things take care of themselves. That was how Victor Wamby, turning people with conscience into people who accepted reality. Chelsea could see it clearly, and her fear didn't stop with Matt. It spread like oil, touching everything she loved, touching Connor, touching the fragile life she'd rebuilt piece by piece. If someone like Matt Clark could be dealt with simply because he had become inconvenient, Chelsea knew the truth: anyone could end up on that list if they stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. She didn't want to wait until she or someone she loved became the next target before she finally woke up. So Chelsea chose to act the only way she knew how: survival instinct she once hated, but now had to rely on to stay alive, quietly, carefully, and without letting anyone know what she was doing until she had something solid in her hands. She couldn't run straight at Victor, because she understood he wasn't just powerful, was experienced at hiding the damage. He'd spent his entire life making other people fall while keeping his own hands clean. Challenging Victor with raw emotion would be suicide. Chelsea knew that, so she started in the most boring, practical place imaginable: the records. Money always left tracks, no matter how carefully those tracks were buried. Newman Enterprises was an empire, and every empire had a base mention: explained payments, numbers with no names, transactions that moved through layers until they no longer looked like what they truly were. Chelsea told herself she wasn't doing this out of curiosity, and she wasn't trying to become a hero. She was doing it because without proof, everything she felt would remain just that: feelings. And feelings could always be dismissed, denied, twisted into the accusation that she was imagining things again. The first nights of digging through old financial files made Chelsea feel hollow in a way she couldn't fully explain. She stared at numbers, codes, spreadsheets that seemed lifeless. Yet her mind kept painting something vivid behind them: someone being watched, someone being cornered in the dark, someone who didn't realize their life was being prepared for demolition with one ruthless decision. Chelsea didn't want to think of Matt Clark as a victim. She wasn't naive enough to forget his past. But that discomfort only pushed her deeper into the cruel moral trap she couldn't escape. Saving Matt wouldn't be about proving Matt was good. It would be about proving the way Victor intended to handle him was wrong. And sometimes, the right thing had nothing to do with whether the person being saved deserved it. The right thing was simply the right thing. Chelsea realized she'd reached that kind of maturity the hard way through scars. She forced herself to stay patient. Even when the files felt like a maze designed to break her spirit, there were moments she wondered if Victor counted on exactly that. On the fact that nobody had the time or the nerve to keep digging. People feared Victor instinctively, and that fear made them quit before they even started. But Chelsea was different. She'd already hit rock bottom. She'd already been judged by the whole city, labeled the failure, the mess. The woman who couldn't get it together. There was a stubbornness in her now. The kind that only appears when a person feels like they have nothing left to lose. That stubbornness pushed her forward even when her eyes burned from staring at screens. Even when her hands trembled at every unexpected sound outside her door. Even when every buzz of her phone made her think Victor had discovered her. After days of grinding through old records, Chelsea began noticing patterns: large payments with vague descriptions. Transactions split into smaller pieces like someone was deliberately avoiding attention. And most of all, a repeated path of money routed through an unclear third party. It wasn't a single mistake. It was structure. And the moment Chelsea recognized that structure, it felt like she was brushing her fingertips against the skin beneath Newman Enterprises. Expensive soothpart outsiders were never supposed to see. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt terrified. Because the clearer the evidence became, the closer the danger felt. If she uncovered what Victor wanted buried, Chelsea wouldn't just be curious anymore. She would become a threat. And Victor never allowed threats to breathe for long. Chelsea knew she needed more than paper trails. She needed people: former employees, old contacts. Anyone who had once worked for Victor and might have seen too much. Anyone discarded the moment they stopped being useful. She approached them not like a cold investigator, but like a woman who understood what it meant to be pushed out of the game. Chelsea chose her words carefully. She didn't ask directly. She didn't reveal her goal. She simply opened doors with small questions about the old days. About decisions that never made sense, about expenses nobody talked about. Each person reacted differently. Some avoided her instantly, as if Victor's name could still choke them even when spoken quietly. Others fell silent for a long time, eyes darkening. Trapped between the urge to speak and the instinct to keep living peacefully. Chelsea didn't force them. She understood that fear. But with every conversation, she collected small fragments: proof that Victor had ways of handling problems that stayed clean, stayed quiet, stayed untraceable, always letting someone else do the dirty part. And if Matt Clark was about to be swallowed by that same system, Chelsea knew there would be no courtroom waiting at the end. When Chelsea followed the trail of that secret account, and the heavy payment to the shadowy third party, she felt like she was standing in front of a locked door that had been sealed for years. That door didn't just contain the secret of Matt, it could contain the history of what Victor had done before. The kind of history that could destroy him if it ever surfaced. And the bitter part was this: Chelsea wasn't even sure exposing it would bring justice. In Genoa City, people sometimes had proof and still lost. Because power could twist even the truth itself. But Chelsea needed it anyway because proof was the only thing keeping her from going insane. Proof was the only thing that allowed her to tell herself, "I'm not imagining this. I'm not being dramatic. This is real." By then, Chelsea understood she needed someone with sharper skills to break down the data, someone intelligent enough to recognize the deeper patterns. Someone familiar enough with Newman Enterprises to read what outsiders would miss. Adam became the obvious answer, and the thought of relying on him made Chelsea ache. Adam was the man she had loved, trusted, and been disappointed by. Adam was also a new man, meaning he understood exactly how Victor operated. But that made him a blade with two edges. He could help Chelsea, or he could become the easiest path for the truth to leak straight back to Victor. Chelsea couldn't fully trust him, but she also couldn't do this alone. So she chose a strategy that felt both smart and cruel. She asked Adam to analyze the data. But she hid her real purpose. She framed it as financial irregularities, as risk management, as something connected to protecting the future, anything that would make Adam believe she was simply guarding herself from fallout inside the Newman empire. Chelsea hated that she had to manipulate him. But she knew she was fighting in Victor's world, no end in Victor's world. Innocence was just another word for vulnerability. Adam moved faster than Chelsea expected, and his sharpness made her feel both relieved and shaken. In no time, Adam began mapping connections, identifying how the money was disguised. How it was disguised again and again, until the trail became nearly invisible. Chelsea stood close, forcing her face into calm, but inside her chest tightened like a fist. Because with every new link Adam uncovered, the danger moved nearer. Chelsea couldn't let Adam realize this was a direct attack on Victor. Because if Adam chose Victor over her, everything Chelsea had done would collapse instantly. But even worse, she recognized something else. Adam might be pulled into this much deeper than she intended. If Victor sensed someone was digging, his suspicion could fall on Adam first. And then Chelsea wouldn't just be trying to save Match, would be putting Adam in the line of fire. The thought lodged in her throat like a stone. Their relationship was complicated, tangled, scarred. But Chelsea had never wanted Adam to be destroyed again. When Chelsea finally held preliminary evidence of the secret account and the suspicious spending, she didn't feel victorious. She felt a chill sweep through her body. Preliminary evidence was like a flashlight in a tunnel. It showed you the path forward. But it also showed you how deep you already were. Chelsea began weighing her future in a different way. If she used this evidence, what would she use it for? To save Matt? To stop Victor? To protect Adam? Or to protect herself and Connor? Chelsea hated that question because it exposed an ugly truth. Sometimes people do the right thing, not only out of morality but out of survival. Chelsea didn't want to pretend she was pure. She was human. She was scared. She was exhausted. And she had moments where she wanted to protect her own interests first. That honesty made her more real, but it also made her ashamed. She was standing on a thin edge. If she acted only for herself, she could become a smaller version of Victor in her own way. But if she did nothing, she would become the silent type of monster she feared most. As Chelsea searched for another route to dig deeper, Phyllis became the most dangerous door in town, yet possibly the most useful one. Chelsea knew Phyllis had survival instincts sharpened to a blade, a sixth sense for secrets, and connections to information other people couldn't reach. Chelsea didn't know if Phyllis had anything directly tied to Matt Clark. But she thought of the AI program, the shady projects, the ways data could be manipulated, hidden, weaponized. If Victor's world was built on controlling truth, then anything linked to those secrets mattered. Chelsea confronted Phyllis carefully, not with pleading, but with the guarded intensity of someone who understood the price of every conversation. In Genoa City, nobody talked to Phyllis without bleeding a little afterward. Chelsea knew that, so she walked into the exchange like stepping barefoot into broken glass, low, deliberate, but still prepared to get cut. Chelsea tried to pull information from Phyllis without pointing directly at Victor too soon. She circled the topics Phyllis couldn't resist: hidden projects, corruption, confidential tech. Secrets that made Phyllis feel like she had leverage. Chelsea understood Phyllis loved the sense of knowing what others didn't. Loved the advantage of information in her hand. Chelsea let her have that feeling because Chelsea needed the truth even if it came in sharp, messy fragments. But facing Phyllis forced Chelsea to recognize her own transformation. She wasn't the woman who only wanted peace anymore. She was learning how to use suspicion like a weapon. She was learning how to speak without revealing everything. She was learning how to look at people as doors that could open or close, depending on what she offered. That realization made Chelsea sad. She could feel herself losing something soft inside, a part of her that once believed she could live without always calculating. But maybe in Genoa City, softness was simply the quickest path to being crushed. When Chelsea finally stepped away from those conversations, she felt stretched to the breaking point. She had preliminary proof. She had whispered hints from the past. She had a map of money and a shadowy third party. But she still lacked the final piece, of clear connection between those payments and Victor's plan to handle Matt. Chelsea knew she was walking across a bridge that wasn't finished. One wrong step and she'd fall. And the thought that terrified her most wasn't falling alone, it was dragging others down with her. Adam, Connor, maybe even Nick and Sharon if she accidentally pulled them into the blast. There were moments Chelsea asked herself why she was doing this at all. Why step into a minefield when she could simply turn away, pretend she never knew, and keep living? Then she remembered the icy sensation in her bones when Victor spoke about Matt Clark. With that casual cruelty, Chelsea understood the answer, because if she turned away, she would no longer recognize herself. She'd done things in the past that made her hate who she'd become. She'd lived inside regret, and she didn't want to crawl back into that coffin. People could live with fear, but living with self-disgust was different. It never let you breathe. Chelsea began considering how to use the evidence not as a weapon to strike Victor immediately, but as a shield, something to create an escape route for herself and Adam. She understood that if Victor sensed anyone digging, he would attack first. And Victor's attacks were never gentle. That meant Chelsea had to prepare for the worst. She needed to protect Connor if she became a target. She needed to keep Adam from becoming a scapegoat. And she needed to make sure the truth didn't die with her. The thoughts felt like riding a whale while still alive, and Chelsea hated how realistic it sounded. But she also knew only fools entered war without planning how to survive the retreat. As the shape of the truth sharpened, Chelsea felt something both terrifying and strangely familiar. She was becoming someone she used to fear. Not Victor, not that, but a version of herself who understood manipulation, calculation, silence at the right moments. She didn't feel proud. She felt lonely. Because she couldn't tell anyone the full truth. She couldn't explain it to Connor. She couldn't trust Adam enough to confess her purpose. She couldn't rely completely on Nick or Sharon. She was carrying a secret heavy enough to kill people, and the longer she carried it, the heavier it became. Chelsea sat alone in the dark, staring at data on her screen like it was a mirror reflecting her future, a future where she might win, or a future where she might be shattered completely. And maybe the most painful part of this journey wasn't even fear of Victor, or disgust at what he planned for Matt, but the slow collapse of Chelsea's belief that Genoa City still had moral guardrails. She used to think that even in this corrupted city, there were lines people wouldn't cross. Now she could see the truth. Those lines only existed as long as Victor allowed them to exist. If he wanted to step over them, everyone else would simply back away and tell themselves, "It's not my problem." Chelsea hated how this system trained people into numbness. And she hated how she was being forced to use the system's rules to try to break it. By the time Chelsea reached the end of those investigative days, she was no longer the same woman. She held pieces of the truth, not enough to destroy Victor, but enough to prove her instincts were right. And as she stored those documents away, hiding them like a bomb waiting to explode, Chelsea felt her heart pound like it was trying to break through her ribs. She knew this war had only begun. She also knew that nobody challenged Victor Newman and walked away untouched. Tomorrow could bring disaster. Victor could discover her. Matt could disappear before she had the chance to do what was right. Yet even inside that fear, Chelsea held onto one fiercely human emotion. She didn't want to regret another moment of her life. If there was one thing I truly felt while shaping this story, it was the ache of a woman forced to choose between safety and conscience. And no matter what she chooses, she will lose a piece of herself forever. Chelsea was walking a road with no light ahead, clinging only to the fragile belief that truth is still worth the cost. But in that final moment, as she looked back at the evidence in her hands, she realized another silence had already begun to swallow everything. Matt Clark was no longer showing up anywhere he used to exist. As if someone had started erasing his footprints and Victor's countdown had officially started. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.